everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Courtney and today I'm going to be doing a discussion video. This is coming from both a person that writes and a person that reads. So I'm coming at this question that I'm posing from two different angles. So the last book I finished was The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea, which unfortunately ended up being kind of a disappointment for me, but it was a disappointing read in a really difficult way to describe. This book had a lot of things that I love. It had a coming-of-age story, a slightly angsty romance, a focus on myth and lore, a really fantastical setting, and yet this book still fell really flat for me. And because I found it so hard to describe or understand why I didn't love this book, I took a lot of time just really dissecting it and really thinking about why that is, because it's happened a lot over the past couple years, just fantasy books not working for me or just not completely satisfying me. And I've been thinking a lot about why that is, why this certain book didn't work for me when it really should have, why was it falling flat, why did it left me feeling unsatisfied, and so that's what we're going to discuss today. So, a brief history lesson for fantasy. In a lot of ways, fantasy really started with the first story that was ever told. We obviously used to use stories and myths as a way to explain the world around us, and from there stories of magic and mystery persisted throughout human history, and they evolved to sometimes be connected to these myths and stories that we were telling and sometimes not be. And then when the novel came around and became a thing, genres slowly began to take form and books began to differentiate themselves, and slowly fantasy evolved from these kind of children's stories into a respected genre. So I'm definitely not trying to downplay the importance of religion. Obviously, a lot of these myths and legends became people's religion, so I'm not trying to exclude that, but I'm just trying to stick with the fantastical, with the fantasy versus how we describe the world and understand the world in a spiritual aspect. And today we have fantasy that is well established, that has multiple subgenres, and there are many ways to tell a fantasy story. Sometimes we keep to fantasy stories in a traditional way, where they are full of whimsy and mystery and magic and the unexplained, and sometimes our fantasy novels are more defined with expectations. So there's not one way to make a good fantasy novel, and in fact there are different ways that authors approach these fantasy novels that they're writing. So a lot of authors have begun to describe or categorize how they write these stories. Brandon Sanderson famously has his first law of fantasy, which depicts the idea of hard and soft fantasy, and this whole idea is related to the idea of magic systems and world building. If you don't know, hard fantasy worlds are worlds that are built around rules in almost a scientific-like way, and there are clear outcomes and expectations for the magic. For example, in Mistborn, an Allomancer can ingest a metal, use it to fuel a variety of specific physical or mental abilities. For example, one person can burn tin and enhance their 5 senses. There are a certain number of metals in the world, and thus there are a certain number of abilities. Most people can use one metal, but there are select few that can use them all. And most importantly, there is a clear-cut idea of who and who cannot use these metals, who and who cannot use these powers, and there is a clear-cut answer for when and where and how people use these metals. For a soft magic system, it's just more built on vibes and whimsy, and it's a lot about the unexplained magic. Magic just exists in the world. You don't have a complete or understanding of the system. One contemporary example of this is the House of the Cerulean Sea. In the House of the Cerulean Sea, magic just kind of exists. There are kids that are born with powers or who are born in monstrous forms, but it's never really qualified or quantified their existence. They just exist. Some more examples of hard fantasy besides Brandon Sanderson would be the Foundry Size series by Robert Jackson Bennett. This has very clear and cut rules of how the magic system works. And some examples for some soft fantasy and sci-fi would be Gideon of the Ninth, Howl's Moving Castle, Uprooted, Winter of the Witch, books where magic exists but it's not necessarily all the way explained. So that has to do with magic systems. When looking more at world building, there are a couple different ways that people use world building and how people categorize and think about it when they're writing it. For example, we have V.E. Schwab, who thinks of doors and windows, and a door fantasy is the idea that there is an open door to the fantasy world. It is left wide open, you can see every single detail, and everything is mapped out and explained. Whereas a window fantasy is where you, as a reader, are just getting a small picture of the world. You're given a limited perspective of how things work, and you're kind of left to kind of fill in the background details and infer the details around the bigger small picture that you're seeing. So a door fantasy, one where you're seeing all the details, the world has to be built very clearly by the author, and the author must use what they have created. They can't expand past that, because if you add more details in when you've already given all the details, readers are going to feel cheated. And for a window fantasy, the author is allowed to expand out, to add things later, to revise things, because the basic rules and the perspective are already known in the world, but again, the world is not known fully or fleshed out fully beyond this little scope that you're getting. For a door fantasy, think of Tolkien. Every detail is explained. It's almost a history book. Whereas a window series, of course, Darker Shade of Magic, you understand the basic magic system, you see a very small view of how these Londons work and interact with each other, but you don't know the vast expanse of the different magic and everything surrounding the different worlds. So what do these ideas of fantasy, magic systems, and world building boil down to? To me, this relates to how you can create a conflict and how you can solve a conflict, or basically what is your major arc for your story. And this can kind of pan out two different ways, and I think it's very dependent on how you're building your fantasy world and your magic systems. Basically, will this problem in your fantasy novel be solved by coincidence and circumstance, or will your problem be solved by beating the odds or finding a loophole? For me, the coincidence or the circumstance is something that you would see more in a soft magic fantasy world or a window world, and a novel where you beat the odds or find a loophole you would often probably see with a door fantasy or a hard magic system. Hard fantasy worlds are built on solid ideas and systems and rules, and you have to find a very convincing way for the character to either beat the odds, to find a way around the rules, in a way that sticks to the details you've already presented, so that the ending doesn't feel contrived, so it doesn't feel like you're cheating the readers when your character finds a way to win. And for soft magic systems, the characters don't need to beat a system because one was never there in the first place, but the ending of the story does need to be satisfying in some way, so characters either need to learn something, to discover something, or overcome obstacles in a natural way. And the reason why I say this is like circumstantial or coincidence is because a lot of times the magic has a whimsy of fate that draws the character back to patterns and circles that you've seen through the beginning of the story. A lot of times the characters are naturally overcoming obstacles with their own will or magic, but it's much more connected to the character's journey and character arc. So a lot of times these stories are very circular, and it's a lot about wrapping up loose threads that you've seen throughout the beginning of the story. And not always, but a lot of times soft fantasy worlds care a lot more about the characters and the vibes, while our hard magic systems, while fantasy worlds and settings are obviously really important because rules are important, a lot of times the plot and the action kind of takes precedent over the setting and the characters. And this is where we come to fantasy books that sit in the middle. And this is where I tend to see a lot of authors try to go, and often where they kind of struggle. For example, The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. I think this was the main problem, that it tried to straddle the world of whimsy and unexplained magic while also being very explained and having a set of rules. 30% into this book, it tried to explain the rules, tried to explain the string of fate and how it worked, when previously the story had been built around unexplained magic and vibes and just whimsy. So it tried to give this big expansive understanding to the world, but it also felt like we didn't flesh out everything. We'll come back to this. So fantasy in the middle, why does it have such a hard time? It has to be explained, but not over-explained. Rules need to make sense. There can't be too many contradictions, but it also can't have too many rules. And going back to my thesis of this, it has to decide what the problem is, how it's created, and how the characters are going to solve the problem. Will it be solved through loopholes, beating the odds, or through circumstance or breaking out of circumstance? And what's really tricky is that the world has to have the right amount of explanation. It has to be very choosy with what it explains. So let's look at some examples of books that I think do a really good job of straddling this middle gray area. For example, we have the Graceling series. Specifically Graceling. This feels like a stable fantasy world. There is one rule of magic, so one conceit. Basically, there's people born with two different eye colors, and the people that are born that way have a special natural gift. It's never really explained fully how these powers came to be, but there is a clear, concise rule to how this world works, and there's not further magic really outside this one conceit. Another example would be Black Sun. Magic has been lost to this world, so the story is really grounded in politics, yet we still have magic that just kind of exists, that's kind of whimsical, that's not really further explained beyond myth. And in a lot of ways, we are getting a lot of details about this world, about this society, but it's still open enough that more details can be added. Another book would be The Girl of Fire and Thorns. This is a really interesting book because it's a slow discovery of the magic and how it works and why it works the way it does. It's never grounded in scientific rules, but again, the world feels grounded. There is an absence of magic besides this one character. Another example would be the 5th season. There is so much about this series that's left in shadow, that is left for discovery, both in the world building and the magic system. But what's really interesting is that in the first book, the magic kind of takes on a more scientific feel, and the book and the magic gets more whimsical towards the end of the novel. It gets more fantastical as it goes on. But why is all this important? Let's get back to the point. Like I said, towing the line, straddling the line between an unexplained fantasy world and an explained one is just a very hard line to straddle. Most stories, I feel like, want to go one way or the other, which is exactly what happened for The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. It felt like it was trying to be both, but the rules never got laid out in a fully convincing way. At the start of the novel, it really felt like we were in a world of whimsy rather than explained magic, so it felt both over-explained and under-explained. We were getting a big info dump about way too many rules that just contradicted each other or didn't really make sense. We were also not getting enough to understand, really. To me, this is a character growth story set in a really fantastical netherworld situation, so it really should have been a soft magic system where the rules don't need to be fully explained. And the biggest thing is that this book let the plot and the action, the quest, kind of take over the character growth story. This book had a lot of really high action, which just felt really out of place for what this story was going for. So a lot of the ending reveals felt really unsatisfying because we weren't getting that character growth, that character moment that seemed to be promised in the first 100 pages or so. And like a lot of these books that kind of fail at straddling the line, the author explains things that I honestly don't think need to be explained, or the things that are in focus are not necessarily the ones that I do think should be in focus, and there's something else in the background instead that's much more interesting or prevalent to the plot that doesn't really fully get to be in the picture. So why is this important to readers? I think a lot of readers are an either-or kind of reader. A lot of people are either character fantasy people, or they care a lot more about the plot and the action. Some people really want to know every detail of how the world works, and some people just kind of want to vibe. Some people want to know and understand how a person is completing or overcoming an obstacle, and some people care more just about how the character gets there. I feel like I get both situations. I would say I lean towards soft fantasy because it tends to be more character driven, and I really care about those characters overcoming the obstacles rather than loopholes, but sometimes it is so satisfying to see an author build a world and then break it apart or have the character find their way through it. But overall, I just want a work to understand what it wants to be. I want a work to understand its trajectory, its story arc, and I want a work to understand what and when the audience needs to know something, when something needs to be explained, and how to communicate it to a reader. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that at the end of the day, a novel is a form of communication, which I honestly think is one of the hardest things to do, is to communicate with others. You're basically trying to take something that you see in your head, where you see every single moving detail, where you're not necessarily seeing all those details in order either, and you're trying to put it into somebody else's head, but only the important bits, only the bits they need to know, and you're supposed to put those bits in at the right time. There's no real way to tell an author how to do that. There's a lot of ways to write a fantasy novel, and there's even a lot of fantasy models that break this mold that I've been talking about in really compelling ways that still work somehow. But with these kind of contrived categories for writing, soft versus hard, door versus window, whatever you want to call magic systems world building, I have seen a recent problem where I don't know if authors are knowingly doing this, but they're really trying to straddle the line between those things, which often makes the novels less compelling because they really should have gone one direction or the other. But tell me if you've been feeling this too, is that a lot of fantasy novels just don't understand themselves, they don't understand what their real focus of the story is, or they're focusing too much on the wrong thing, and it starts at the world building. When you don't know if you want to be a rule fantasy or a whimsical fantasy, you don't know how to shape the plot, the story arcs, the characters around that world, and that's where it starts to fail. Because once you understand the kind of story you're trying to tell, I think it becomes a lot easier to tell that story. Not that you have to follow completely into a mold or systems or a particular way of doing things, but if you know how you're telling a story, I think it makes it easier to tell that story. Long story short, it's a lot harder to write fantasy than just having a cool concept or a cool setting. It takes a lot of work. And as a reader, it's really disappointing when a book doesn't meet our expectations, when it falls flat or falls short. But what is the real conclusion besides authors understanding how to tell their story better? I don't know, maybe the publishing industry just needs to give authors more time and more resources. Maybe that's the answer, who knows? But let me know what you think about this topic down below, if this is something you've noticed or thought about. Is there a type of fantasy you lean towards? Do you like details? Do you like rules? Or do you like whimsy and vibes and characters just kind of plodding along? Let me know. This is not a hard and fast guide. This was more just a question I had trying to come up with some kind of explanation, but I hope it was interesting in some way. But thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later and happy reading.